Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving into some, really thought-provoking ideas about the origins of Christianity. In particular, the claim that Paul, yes, Paul the Apostle,
Right.
essentially hijacked the message of Jesus.
That's such a bold assertion. It almost sounds like a theological thriller. Can you break down exactly what's being argued here?
Sure. So, the central idea here is that the early movement following Jesus wasn't eventually defined by the religion we know today, but originally it was led by Jesus' own family, specifically his brother James, who was respected as the leader of a very Torah-observant, anti-Roman apocalyptic community.
Yep. So let me get this straight. Instead of Peter, which is the common narrative, the leadership mantle passed to James, right?
Exactly. According to the argument, after Jesus was crucified between 30 and 35 CE, his disciples scattered, but it was James who took up the responsibility, not Peter, as later traditions claim. James's group was heavily rooted in Jewish law, circumcision, kosher rules, keeping the Sabbath, all of
I
that.
see. And then along comes Paul, who claims he had a private vision of Jesus. But that version seems to diverge radically from James's practices, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. It's like Paul's vision completely overhauls that initial message. It's as if he says, hey, none of that old circumcision, dietary laws,
exactly.
or stringent Sabbath observance matters anymore.
And instead, Paul introduces what? A message of salvation by faith that really opens the door for a Gentile, more, Hellenistic audience.
Spot on. And that's why many refer to his teachings as the religion of Paul. He's credited with laying out doctrines like justification by faith and turning Christianity into something more flexible under Roman rule.
Absolutely. That's pretty radical if you think about it. It shifts the religion's foundation almost completely. But why is Eisenman so critical of Paul?
Eisenman sees Paul not as the bridge between Jews and Gentiles, but rather as a traitor who systematically dismantled the original Jewish version of Jesus' message. He claims that Paul wasn't simply a convert, but a kind of, heretic who, through his letters and strategic maneuvering, replaced the original teachings with a theology that was, in a sense, engineered to thrive under the Roman Empire.
I can imagine that would ruffle a few feathers. It really does. And to add, there's this fascinating bit where Eisenman ties Paul to the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? How does that connection work?
Right, so here's where things get even more intense. Eisenman refers to a figure in the Dead Sea Scrolls known as the Spouter of Lies, a charismatic teacher who misleads his followers with false doctrine. And he suggests that this figure might actually be none other than Paul.
That's wild. And then juxtaposed to that is the so-called teacher of righteousness, who, in Eisenman's narrative, is identified with James. It's almost like a symbolic showdown between the true leader and the usurper.
Precisely. That contrast paints a picture of two competing strands of early Christianity, one led by James, firmly anchored in Jewish tradition and apocalyptic expectations, and the other led by Paul, pushing a redefined, spiritualized version of salvation that dismisses many Jewish customs.
Very intriguing. But how do they support this claim? I mean, isn't the bulk of the New Testament built around Paul's letters, which made up nearly half of it?
True, and that's exactly his point. Paul's writings have, over the centuries, explicitly shaped what we consider Orthodox Christianity. Eisenman argues that those letters, like in Galatians, reveal not unity but deep-seated conflicts. For example, Paul himself recounts a confrontation with Peter, calling him out for hypocrisy, and also mentions disputes with certain men from James's circle.
That does hint at some tension. So, in a way, the later narrative, think of the book of Acts, might have been a kind of propaganda tool to present a united front and cover up this internal strife.
Exactly. Eisenman asserts that Acts was written decades later to, whitewash the very real division between Paul's vision and the original Jerusalem-based movement that followed James.
Interesting perspective. But here's a question. Why would later Christian writers, who might have known the truth, agree to bury James's role in history?
That's the million-dollar question. Eisenman suggests it was convenient for those who wanted to promote the gospel of empire, the version of Christianity that was easier to align with Roman political and social norms. Acknowledging James's group would mean recognizing a form of Christianity that was radically Jewish and, frankly, too disruptive to the emerging imperial order.
Right, that makes some sense. So, in essence, Eisenman believes that modern Christianity is more a theological remix than a direct continuation of what Jesus originally taught.
Absolutely. It's like, imagine if the original band changed its lead singer and then completely rewrote its hit songs, only the new version ended up dominating the airwaves. Paul's version, with its emphasis on mystical salvation by faith and distancing from traditional Jewish law, essentially replaced the original version led by James.
Yep, that's an apt analogy. But playing devil's advocate for a minute, do you think Eisenman might be overstating the case against Paul? After all, many scholars argue that there's insufficient evidence to cast Paul definitively as a heretic or traitor.
That's a respectful challenge for sure. Many mainstream scholars reject Eisenman's conclusions, arguing there's little solid evidence to back such claims. They point out that the Dead Sea Scrolls are generally considered to predate Christianity and that the internal debates in Paul's letters are, well, part of normal early religious discourse.
That criticism is definitely worth considering. Right. It seems, then, that while Eisenman's theory is provocative and offers a radical rethinking, we need to balance it with the broader scholarly consensus on the development of early Christianity.
Exactly. It forces us to ask, why did Paul's version triumph? Was it purely theological merit? Or were there broader socio-political forces at play, like the need to unify a diverse community under Roman rule?
Yeah, that's a key point. I suppose it also highlights how historical narratives can be reshaped over time. I mean, the narrative in the Book of Acts is almost like a crafted story with a particular agenda, isn't it?
Definitely. Acts is portrayed as a seamless tale of unity and divine orchestration, yet it glosses over these explosive debates. It's like editing out all the awkward, contentious moments from a rehearsal tape before releasing the final album.
Right, that's a vivid analogy. And it leaves us pondering the what-ifs of history. What if, say, James's faction had prevailed instead? How might Christianity look today if it had retained its more rigorously Jewish and apocalyptic roots?
Exactly. That's the intriguing part. It challenges our assumptions about a faith that's been so entrenched for nearly 2 millennia. Could the emphasis on grace over law, as popularized by Paul, be seen more as a strategic adaptation rather than a faithful transmission of Jesus'
really
original message?
And while some dismiss Eisenman's claims as too speculative, the discussion itself opens up fascinating avenues for re-examining historical texts and the evolution of religious thought.
Absolutely. It reminds us that our sacred histories are often contested territories, a mix of theology, politics, and human ambition. It's like peeling back layers of an onion. Each layer reveals a new narrative that might have been lost in time.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. It really is. And I think it's important for listeners to engage with these ideas critically. The idea that perhaps what we perceive as Christianity is not a singular, unbroken tradition, but rather a product of internal conflicts and power struggles.
Exactly. It's inviting us, in a way, to question established narratives. But, while Eisenman's theory is radical, it also sparks dialogue about how history is recorded, which voices are amplified, and which are silenced.
Definitely. And isn't that the beauty of such discussions? They push us to probe deeper, reconsider accepted histories, and maybe even discover some uncomfortable truths that have long been buried under layers of tradition.
Exactly. Even if you take the mainstream view, it's valuable to explore these alternative perspectives because they remind us that history isn't static, it's constantly being reinterpreted.
Definitely, yeah. So, Would you say this narrative about Paul essentially being the architect of a kind of theological coup holds any water, or is it more of a provocative reimagining of events?
It's provocative, no doubt about that. I mean, while the evidence might not be conclusive enough to fully overturn established doctrine, it sure opens up a space for debate. It's like looking at an old painting under a new light. You might notice brushstrokes you never appreciated before.
Right on. And that's what makes this discussion so compelling. It challenges us to re-examine what we think we know about faith, power, and history. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating ride.